Thank you very much for inviting me to present this paper. This is joint work with also Michael McMahon, who is actually in the room, Stephen Hansen and Song Xiao. We just finished a major revision of this paper, so any comments would be super useful. And I should admit that this project has been very long in the pipeline. So hopefully we are converging on something that is informative. Let me start by giving you a little bit of motivation. We were asking what is about decision-making at the Fed that has actually contributed to what could be thought as a major success of policymaking since the late 1980s. And we were particularly interested in the role that uncertainty plays in decision-making of the FOMC. So when policymakers speak, they frequently refer to uncertainty as something that is shaping their daily jobs. And I am sure that you experience this on a daily basis as well. So here are two quotes from Greenspan and Bernanke, talking about how uncertainty is pervasive and how they actually need to take it into account when making their decisions. But then we ask ourselves, well, what does it actually mean for their decision making? So how does uncertainty that policymakers perceive affect their behavior, affect their decisions? And we immediately ran into some challenges. First, it seems that there is no canonical theoretical model, and the models that we have give ambiguous predictions, something that I will talk about in a second. And of course, uncertainty is unobservable or hard to measure, especially when we want to focus on uncertainty that policymakers themselves perceive and how that affects their decision making. So we'll try to address these challenges and make a little bit of progress in answering this question. So what do we do in this paper? We first try to explain when and how uncertainty affects decision making. We'll distinguish the notion of what we call Fed-driven uncertainty or policy-driven uncertainty from economic uncertainty that is exogenous to the Fed, that the Fed may react to, but doesn't itself influence. We will then need to recover beliefs about economic distributions that policymakers perceive. And we will use text of FOMC's deliberations to do that. We will construct two measures of those beliefs. One is what we will call PMU, policymakers' uncertainty. And these indices will be for inflation, real economy, markets, financial markets uncertainty perceived by policymakers, as well as model uncertainty that they perceive. And to control for any directional views on the economy as opposed to uncertainty, we'll also measure what we call their sentiment. The second type of measures that we will construct is actually a proxy for their decision. And we want to capture forward-looking decision-making. So again, we will resort to the text of the meetings and we'll construct a balance measure between hawkish and dovish leanings directly from the transcripts of FOMC meetings, from the policymakers' language there. And we will show how this language is informative about not just the current decision, but about the entire path of policy that at any given meeting, policymakers envision. And the new result that we get from all this is that perceived inflation uncertainty leads to more hawkish policy stance in the sample from late 80s, that is when Greenspan comes to the office, until 2015. And later I will tell you why 2015 is the right cutoff, given that we believe that the perceptions of policymakers changed dramatically around that time. And so perceived inflation uncertainty seems to lead to more hawkish policy stances over and above any standard policy controls. And we will argue that the reason for why this happens in that sample period is because policymakers are particularly concerned about upper inflation tail risks. And that concern is there even when inflation expectations seem to be really stable or relatively stable, not far away from the target. And we'll have a reason for why this is the case. So let me just give you a headline regression that I will spend the whole talk trying to get to. So here is the result that shows perceived inflation uncertainty. That is this inflation PMU, Policymakers Uncertainty Index, constructed for FOMC members, predicts significantly, with a variety of controls, a more hawkish policy stance. And the dependent variable here is the policy stance from the transcripts of the FOMC meetings. And you can see with a variety of control, there is a positive loading. These are all standardized coefficients. So that effect doesn't seem to be subsumed either by Green Book forecasts prepared by the staff, currently they are called Teal Book, or public uncertainty measures. That is what the public outside of the Fed perceive. And we'll argue that this result is consistent with Fed-driven uncertainty, and in particular is consistent with Fed concerns about upper inflation tail risks, as which is a sort of new setting that we propose. So what are the channels through which uncertainty could affect policymaking? Let us start with the very basic framework that a lot of us are thinking about when we think about decision-making at the Fed or at the central bank. That's some kind of policy rule. On the left-hand side, you have the policy instrument, and the instrument is set by responding to the economy. There might be some discretionary monetary policy shock. We typically estimate the parameters of this rule by just projecting the instrument on predetermined macroeconomic forecasts. Say, green books are typically used to estimate this for the US. And that captures the decision rule, which hopefully is somehow made optimally. Now, let us review what are what can be said about the effects of uncertainty in these types of settings. Well, we can say a lot in the context of the traditional Taylor rule, in the sense that uncertainty really doesn't matter. So in the traditional Taylor rule, we don't really expect there to be any effect of uncertainty on decision making. This happens in the linear quadratic world, and I will show you an example of this in a second. So that's essentially a very well-defined but uninteresting case where uncertainty doesn't matter. Recent literature has been talking a lot about uncertainty as economic uncertainty driven by, say, uncertainty about demand, acting actually as a demand shock. And that leads to effects on the real economy. But per se, it doesn't violate certainty equivalence, because the central bank will just respond to the economy and not additionally to uncertainty. Now, there is literature that talks about theoretical models of optimal policy under uncertainty. And this uncertainty is typically attached to parameters or models. And here the predictions are ambiguous. So what policymakers frequently refer to is so-called Brainard's conservatism. When I am uncertain about certain policy multipliers, I become more cautious. But it turns out that this Brainard's conservatism is really specific to a particular model setting. And depending on where you place uncertainty in the model, you may actually get more activist, aggressive response in the face of uncertainty compared to the traditional certainty equivalence type of rules. So I will illustrate Brainard's conservatism in a second in a very simple framework where I will assume that policymakers has an objective function where they are optimizing the deviations of inflation from the target and output from the target. This is a quadratic symmetric rule. Arguably, this is what the Fed's mandate is, and what policy was in the period that we study. The policymaker chooses now the interest rate to minimize the expected losses. So we can express the expected loss function as squared deviations, and there will be these variance terms. When we think about the classic Taylor rule, we assume some linear dependence of these means expectations of output and inflation on the policy rate. That's a very simplified way of writing it, just to present the intuition. And from that, we solve for the optimal R or R hat. What is less typical is to also take into consideration any type of effect of policy on second moments of the distribution. And so we will actually focus exactly on these items highlighted in red, and this is where our Fed managed uncertainty will come about. So to illustrate how you can get the standard Taylor rule from this setting, let's just take the first order condition. And in the Taylor rule, uncertainty doesn't matter. So these Fed managed uncertainty terms disappear. That gives us the classic certainty equivalence benchmark. What we call Fed-driven uncertainty is when these actually uncertain terms do not disappear, in the sense that volatilities or second moments of objects that the Fed cares about are influenced by the policy rate. So I have written it here in this simplified form. Obviously, the name of the game is then solve for this R hat in these models. So this highlights the key aspect of the analysis. For uncertainty to matter in decision making, policy needs to be able to affect that uncertainty. So for example, if there is a situation where raising interest rates reduces inflation uncertainty, the Fed will then prefer to choose more hawkish policy compared to a certainty equivalence benchmark. But the signs can go both ways. Hiking can either increase or reduce uncertainty, and then we'll have different implications for what we should expect to find. So let me illustrate Brainard's conservatism in this super simple stylized framework. So now assume that the transmission parameters, that is how the Fed is affecting outcomes that they care about, are actually not known. And specifically, when you go 2 slides back, I will assume that in this response of inflation to monetary policy, the coefficient A now becomes a random variable. That's actually what the benchmark Brainard setting does. And so what arises under this assumption is that the volatility, the uncertainty surrounding that parameter, will also play a role in determining the optimal policy. Here we are just specifying some exogenous variation in uncertainty about the parameter A that enters into the denominator of that reaction function. Notice that policymakers will choose a higher policy rate if the deviations are above target. That's standard, but now A is replaced with A bar. What is conservatism in this setting? What does Brainard conservatism principle imply? Notice that when uncertainty about A parameter increases, that is sigma squared is higher, that will dampen the response of policy compared to the certainty equivalence benchmark. That dampening effect means that the policymaker would like to do more, but uncertainty pushes them to do less. In that sense, that is the conservative reaction. Notice also that this setting doesn't give you a directional prediction, in the sense that policymaker will behave more conservatively, that will attenuate their decision compared to certainty equivalent benchmark, both when policy is above or the targets are not reached from above or from below. So in both cases, there is a tendency to do less than they would otherwise. And so in that sense, there is no clear directional prediction. There is, however, a conditional prediction when the inflation, expected inflation and output are above targets. Uncertainty will actually act to reduce the desire to hike in this situation. So we should see a negative sign on uncertainty loading in this situation. And we will exploit these comparative statics based on this model to differentiate between theories of how uncertainty affects policy decisions. Now, we'll propose an alternative channel to that certainty equivalent, to that Brainard's or parameter uncertainty type of models. And the motivation for us is purely empirical, in the sense that we want to understand what can give rise to that hawkishness in the face of uncertainty, unconditional hawkishness, in fact, that we document empirically. And as I mentioned, the classic Brainard's conservatism doesn't give you a directional prediction. It gives you a conditional directional prediction, which we will test in the data. So we will propose that FOMC is particularly sensitive over the sample period to perceptions of upper inflation tail risks, that are small probabilities of large inflation outcomes, and those probabilities are actually dependent on Fed's policy. Think about this as Fed causing unanchoring of inflation expectations. And that idea goes back to the inflation scares literature as proposed by Goodfriend. So we will capture this notion in a very simple way. We will assume that there exists a policy-dependent inflation tail risk, and we will keep all the other elements standard. So in this kind of setting, we just assume that probability PT is a function of the policy, and that probability captures the tail event, inflation tail event happening. When that event happens, inflation will jump, expected inflation will jump by some positive delta. And we will also assume that probability, tail risk probability, is less than half, to capture the idea that this is a tail event, low probability event. So in general, analyzing, getting this kind of very neat standard solution that we obtain for a Taylor rule is not that easy here, but we can characterize the solution, and we can obtain some comparative statics from that. So this is the first order condition, and you see that there is a probability that enters into that decision rule, and as well as its derivative. We characterize that solution in the paper's appendix. Let me just say what this setting implies for our empirical analysis. It specifically implies that the policy rate will be sensitive to both the probability of the jump and the size of the jump, with a positive sign. That means that when the probability of the tail event increases, or the perceived size of the jump increases, the Fed will tighten policy, will become more hawkish. And that happens whenever the Fed is close to, from below, or above the target. So this implies that even when inflation seems to be close to the target, the policymaker may already start to worry about upper inflation tail risk. And that kind of behavior, that thinking about that worry about inflation tails, which we'll argue are motivated by credibility concern, can explain what Shapiro and Wilson documented in their review of economic studies paper, that over a period where the Feds had very stable where inflation was very stable, the Fed displayed actually a preference for inflation target below 2%. And that can arise endogenously in this model due to the worries about upper inflation tail risks. As a caveat, this kind of story applies in the period that we are analyzing. From 2015 onward, you can argue, and we have argued in our joint work with Michael elsewhere for the Brookings recently, that starting from 2015, the Fed's thinking has changed and the worries became shifted to lower tail of inflation, with some consequences for the Fed's risk management during the in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. That's a separate story. For here, we want to understand what was in particular going on in their decision making that actually contributed to this very successful inflationary outcome in post late 80s sample. So what are the predictions from this model? From the tail risk model, will show that inflation uncertainty is positively related to expected inflation. That is, when expected inflation starts going up beyond target, inflation uncertainty will start to matter for decision making. Inflation tail risk will induce more hawkish policy, and that's a directional effect. And it will operate as that proposition shows when inflation nears or exceeds the inflation target. So we want to test these projections and to compare those to what would be implied by models of parameter uncertainty that I just laid out. So we need to overcome a bunch of measurement challenges. Again, what we care about are policymakers' own perceptions of uncertainty that do not necessarily coincide or overlap with public perceptions of uncertainty, for the simple reason that the public already conditions on a particular path of policy. So to measure these beliefs, we will exploit the text of FOMC transcripts at the speaker sentence level for 227 meetings, starting with Greenspan and ending in December 2015. We will also use expectations from Green Books, currently Teal Books, prepared by the staff. And we will construct the proxies for PMU sentiment and policy stances. So I described to you already the three types of textual proxies that we will use for the analysis. Different types of uncertainty that policymakers perceive, sentiment to capture potentially any deviation in the expectations, in the first moment beliefs, or in some skews that policymakers perceive over and above Green Book forecasts, which are likely to be model. And finally, our main outcome variable will be this measure of policy stance, which captures relative hawkishness and dovishness of deliberations in the meeting. Now, what is the key assumption? Let us go back to when we estimate the standard Taylor rule. The assumption that we make when we regress the policy instrument on the forecasts is that these forecasts are predetermined with respect to the decision that is taken at the given meeting. This is how we can estimate the coefficients. Here we will make the same assumption on PMU. We will argue that the uncertainty that policymakers perceive when they enter the meeting is predetermined with respect to the decision that they are going to take at that meeting. That is, the uncertainty is unaffected by the decision that they are taking. And to do that, for identification, we will exploit the structure of the transcripts of the meetings. So these meetings over our sample period proceed in 3 rounds. We'll focus, the structure is consistent across the sample period. We will focus on the economy round when policymakers discuss economic conditions without yet discussing what this means for the policy, or discussing how decision taken at this meeting affects these conditions. So that is the predetermined uncertainty that we can measure from these deliberations. And for part of the analysis, we use both the entire economy round, which also contains staff. For most of the results that I am going to show you, I will talk about the beliefs that policymakers themselves express about uncertainty and the economy. The Hogg-Dove score, that is the measure of the policymakers' stance on policy, will be obtained only from the statements by policymakers, FOMC members, in the policy round of the meeting. That means we will not use any language of policymakers, and we will also identify only those sentences that refer to monetary policy itself, not all sentences in the policy round. We use some very standard approaches to construct these indices. We'll use word embeddings for risk and uncertainty, and we will construct topic-specific PMUs by measuring local co-occurrences of uncertainty words with topic-specific terms. So our topics are going to cover inflation, real economy, financial markets, and these model uncertainty or parameter uncertainty, and the residual, which cannot be grouped into those categories, will go into the other unclassified uncertainty type. And I should mention, feel free to ask questions on the way.
Yes, I just have one question about the previous slide. So, or the one about the structure of the FOMC, yes, the previous one, the 16. So about about the structure of the FOMC deliberations. So did you see or checked if this structure is specific for expected announcement, or because as far as I remember, maybe it's not the case for unexpected announcement during crisis or stuff like that.
So I should thank you for bringing this up. We only use scheduled meetings because this is where the transcript is very comprehensive. There are conference calls that happen in between meetings. They are typically much shorter, and we don't exploit that part of the corpus. At some point, I think we did, but because the structure is irregular and the policy language is mixed with the economy language, the identification becomes much more difficult. So this is only scheduled meetings. Thank you for asking about this.
Yeah, for sure, with pleasure. But this is where uncertainty is higher. So maybe you are missing some points by excluding these meetings.
That is possible, but okay. Why are they meeting? They are meeting because there has been some exogenous event. Typically, where were these meetings frequent? They were frequent when there were crises. COVID, there was an unscheduled meeting during the financial crisis, LTCM, and so on. There were unscheduled meetings there. And that, I think, is going to be captured by our uncertainty as a demand shock. And by the way, even if there is an unscheduled meeting, you would expect that they talk about the consequence, or they talk about that event as well in the meeting that comes up. So I think to some extent, at least, our language would capture that. And we, for example, saw that the language in the meeting about at least in particular, the real economy language was certainly reflecting worries leading up to the 2008 financial crisis. So I agree with you that we could do a refinement, but I think a lot of these effects we capture. Maybe Michael wants to address anything in addition.
No, I was just going to say that what you said is exactly right, Jonathan. When you get onto the later bits, you'll see that there's a real distinction between what you might think of as commonly understood uncertainties, so like financial crises or Mexico peso crisis, things where the markets are also measuring them. When we chuck those in, you're going to see, and I think they're the ones that are most heightened around these conference calls. I think it's relatively rare that they would have a conference call just because the output gap looks like it's a little bit bigger. I mean, there's probably one or so two in the sample, but I don't think it. You'll see when Anna throws in the controls for external uncertainties.
All right.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So here is the data that we are going to work with. When you work with the textual data, you need to live with text, with noise in the text. So the data is definitely quite volatile. We don't smooth the series for our analysis, but for the purposes of this graph, you see the inflation PMU moving around at the smoothed by 8 meetings. And so what is on the y-axis is the intensity of inflation uncertainty being mentioned in the meeting. And so when you see 0.01, it means that 1% of all the language in the economy round has the connotations with inflation uncertainty. You may think, wow, this is not a lot. No, in fact, this is a lot compared to raw talk about, say, unemployment or inflation. That's a very significant fraction of language. Now, we are able to classify 84% of uncertainty mentions using that dictionary based on word embeddings in those economy rounds of the meetings. And the 3 types of uncertainty that I am displaying here, that is pertaining to inflation, real economy, and markets, contribute the most of uncertainty mentions in the discussions. What is particularly interesting and was surprising to me is that you would expect inflation and economy uncertainty to be co-moving strongly, but this is not what we find. We find low correlations between these indices. They move at a different frequency, and they rise at different moments in time, so the correlation is weak, in fact. And you will see that they generate independent effects on decision making. Now, as our second step, we need to measure the policy stance. And of course, you could use some standard policy instrument, but in this period, remember that policymakers were really forward-looking about their decision-making. And so the deliberations in the meeting allow us to capture that aspect, and also to extend the sample through the zero lower bound period, where otherwise the direct policy instrument is not available. So for the purposes of most of the analysis, we will construct a balance of hawkish and dovish policy stances in the meeting, and we will aggregate that to the meeting level. So T here denotes a meeting T. Of course, we can measure these objects at the level of each individual, and I will show you a little bit of results related to this. So we have an algorithm that allows us to identify sentences that refer to policy only in the policy rounds, and we only, again, use the language of FOMC members, not the staff, to construct that balance variable. It turns out that it has really interesting properties. So what I am showing you here is the Fed funds rate, which is the direct policy rate. And I am superimposing the Hogg-Dove score extracted from the meeting's language. And what is striking about that black line, Hogg-Dove score, is that it anticipates what happens in the policy rate down the road. In fact, what we document in the paper is that it is a very strong predictor of the policy rate over and above any of the Green Book macroeconomic controls, which tells you that it is not just capturing some perceptions of macroeconomic conditions that contribute to current policy, but on top of it, it captures other factors determining the decisions at the Fed. And our goal is to understand these other non-standard factors in their decision making. And of course, you can see also that the HD moves around during the zero lower bound in the direction that you would expect, consistent with it capturing the forward-looking or more comprehensive views on policy. Just to show you a little bit of validation of this measure, it is actually very informative about shocks that are commonly used as monetary policy shocks. This is a scatter plot of the HD score against the Romer and Tromer shocks, and that purely textual measure explains 25% of variation in Romer and Romer shocks, and is super highly significant in terms of its statistical power. So let me go to the main empirical analysis, asking how uncertainty affects policy stance in the meeting. So this is the baseline projection. We use simply on the left-hand side HD, and on the right-hand side a variety of proxies, textual measures. And what we want to focus on is this effect of inflation PMU and real economy PMU. So let me first say that a robust finding from all this is that inflation PMU leads policymakers to be more hawkish than they would otherwise be based on a variety of controls. So for now, I'm showing you results without any controls. And now I am adding controls. These controls do subsume a little bit of variation, but the PMU itself remains highly significant. What is also important is that inflation PMU and real economy PMU are pushing policy stances in opposite direction. That is, inflation uncertainty wants policymakers to become more hawkish, whereas real economy PMU is wanting them to make more dovish. Now, remember that these objects are not highly correlated, so these are separate channels. Importantly, however, we can drive out the perceptions of a real economy uncertainty with the additional controls, in particular with Green Book controls and the policymakers' sentiments. What this means is that perceived uncertainty about the real economy captures the demand channel of uncertainty, whereby policymakers upgrade or downgrade their beliefs about the economic outlook, and so uncertainty feeds onto their perceptions of first moment perceptions, but on its own, it doesn't give rise to additional effect. So there is no Fed managed uncertainty with regards to a real economy. That is in contrast with inflation PMU. The fact that inflation PMU remains significant with a host of controls suggests that this Fed-driven uncertainty channel, Fed's managed uncertainty channel, is operational. That means that the Fed needs to believe they can affect uncertainty about inflation in order for it to matter in their decision making. So if this is indeed Fed-driven uncertainty and the channel operates through FOMC perceptions of inflation tail risk motivated by credibility concerns, we would expect a stronger link between FOMC members' perceptions and policy stances as opposed to staff perceptions of uncertainty. Why? Because staff should simply report objective uncertainty without really taking into account that risk management aspect. So when we run the projections of HD on inflation PMU separately by the FOMC members vis-a-vis the staff, the entire significance comes from the FOMC's perceptions, not from the staff's perceptions. And you can see this in the graph that when you compare the uncertainty that policymakers perceived vis-a-vis the staff, really these prolonged fluctuations of uncertainty in expansions are the feature of FOMC's language. This discrepancy is particularly visible for inflation and is much less present for uncertainty about the real economy. Again, this is consistent with both FOMC and staff perceiving exogenous uncertainty in the economy, which might affect the first moment beliefs about through the demand channel, and Fed managed uncertainty on the inflation side. Inflation PMU of policymakers seems to capture these Fed managed uncertainty concerns. Now, I have showed you results for the prediction of HD, which is the language-based measure of policy stance. But does PMU also have a material effect on the actual outcomes, actual policy decisions through the policy rate? So this figure is showing you this just in raw data, where I am displaying the PMU, inflation PMU in red, and the policy rate in gray. That's the Fed funds rate, as well as the shadow rate in dotted line. The shadow rate comes from the work of Wu and Xia. So you can see that uncertainty increases ahead of situations where the policy rate is hiked. Now, to quantitatively assess this effect, we we run predictive regressions and plot sort of impulse responses. So this has a lot of controls. We control for all the standard Green Book forecast, public perceptions of uncertainty, and so on. And we assess how uncertainty at meeting T is affecting the policy rate at up to 8 meetings ahead. And the left panel shows you this result for inflation PMU, both for the target rate, FFR target, and the shadow rate at 8 meetings ahead. You see that the one standard deviation increase in PMU predicts about 30 basis points tighter policy rate than it would otherwise be. And that effect is very large. It is larger, in fact, than what you would get from the impact of real GDP growth on the actual policy rate. In contrast, the effect of real economy PMU is only marginally significant or insignificant. It's negative, but statistical significance is much weaker, and economic significance as well. So you might be worried that what we are capturing with these indices are beliefs that are heterogeneous on the committee as opposed to common beliefs of the committee as a whole. So we can actually verify this because our textual indices can be constructed at the level of each individual speaker at the meeting. And so we construct individual indices, these are those ITs, and we project individual policy stances on their own policy preferences. You see that the number of observations increases as this is the number of meetings times the number of participants now. And notice that the significant coefficient is present for the inflation PMU as before, and it continues to be positive, meaning that each policymaker, within each policymaker, there is still this effect of inflation uncertainty making the policy stance, their preferred policy stance, more hawkish. But is this effect driven by some, can this effect be driven out by common perceptions on the committee? And you will see that as soon as we put either the aggregate indices or meeting level fixed effect, the individual inflation coefficients is fully absorbed. What this tells you is that this is the entire committee that is moving in their perceptions of uncertainty as opposed to heterogeneity of views on the committee that is driving our results. I will say that in terms of heterogeneity, we do find, even with time fixed effects or meeting level controls, we do find that this other uncategorized type of uncertainty matters and make individual policymakers less hawkish or more dovish than otherwise. This is the negative coefficient. But we also know that in aggregate, this other uncertainty across members, when aggregated for all members, doesn't matter. So this doesn't seem to be a prime effect. Okay, so what are the additional properties? We do a lot to verify that our PMU indices indeed capture internal policymakers' uncertainty perceptions. So we show a bunch of features. In particular, it seems that PMU doesn't predict future path of inflation. Or future path of output, the sentiment indices do. So it doesn't seem like an obvious first moment belief that we are capturing here. Also, what we don't do, and that is for a good reason, we don't distinguish between risk and uncertainty in the construction of the measures. We found that these two notions of risk and uncertainty are not distinguishable in policy language, the time variation in risk perception and in uncertainty perception over time is very highly correlated. And that is consistent with what Greenspan already told us, that it's very difficult for them to distinguish the notion of risk and uncertainty directly, even though in our theories, the distinction is very clear. Okay, so why do we find these effects of PMU related to inflation on policy? Why does Fed-driven uncertainty arise only in the context of inflation PMU and not real economy PMU? And one channel that I laid out early on is that concern about upper inflation tail risks that policymakers have. We will argue that one reason for why this arises is credibility concerns. Before we do that, there are additional predictions from the tail risk model that can help us distinguish this channel from standard parameter uncertainty channels. First, I highlighted that tail risks should operate only when expected inflation nears or exceeds the Fed's inflation target. It is not meaningful to believe that the Fed is worried about upper tail inflation when inflation is significantly below target. So what we do is we construct, to test that, we construct a measure of deviations of inflation from the target using perceived inflation target. And we split the meetings in our sample into those where the inflation is below versus where it is above target. And you can see that the inflation PMU is only significant when inflation is high relative, expected inflation is high relative to target, precisely where we would expect the tail risk concerns to operate. The difference between high and low inflation environments in terms of PMU impact is statistically significant. That is tested in column 4. In columns 5 through 7, we consider splitting the meetings by the real GDP growth forecast from Green Books. Remember that in the simple comparative statics from the uncertainty model, both deviations of inflation from the target as well as deviations of growth or output from the target were important. And so what you can see here is that that split doesn't differentiate in terms of how inflation PMU is affecting policy stance. And the interaction is insignificant also for the growth itself. So what this is telling you is that the split where inflation or the conditions where inflation PMU uncertainty matters and affects decisions are particular to perceptions of inflation itself, and this doesn't just capture some overall variation in over the business cycle. Now, to show this in raw data, you can see on the left-hand side the measure of the deviation of inflation expectations from Green Books from the target superimposed against inflation PMU. And as the model predicts, this is essentially by assumption in the tail risk model that inflation concerns will be higher when inflation starts to exceed the target. And you can see this clearly in the left-hand graph. The model also has the prediction that the policymakers' sentiment for inflation will be positively correlated with their beliefs about inflation uncertainty, which is what you see in the right graph. The correlation between the inflation PMU and sentiment is driven by concerns about inflation moving up in their language. And we provide some additional results on this in the appendix. Now, what about linking more to models of parameter uncertainty? So what I mentioned before is that in these models, the effect of uncertainty shows up as either conservative behavior or under, that's Breiner's conservatism, or under alternative assumption as policymaker being more activist. But conservatism or activism are not really predictions, directional predictions. You can be both more conservative on the upside as well as more conservative on the downside, which means that on the upside you hike less, on the downside you ease less. And so perhaps we can, in our sample, it happens to be so that our meetings are split or are tilted towards having a particular policy tilt. And so we, in that case, we may still find a directional effect driven by conservatism or activism. If there is a directional tilt that is sample specific for our particular period. So to test that, we first we split meetings by the directional tilt, whether it's a cutting tilt or a hiking tilt, using two different metrics I will talk about in a second. And we check whether the signs of the effects of uncertainty are consistent with either activism or conservatism in for those particular meetings. Here is what you would predict in terms of the signs for these meetings. Again, just to clarify, conservatism is pushing you against the decision that you want to make. That is, making you do less than what would be otherwise warranted under certainty equivalence. So do we find those signs? We determine the policy tilt based on measuring an interest rate cycle, that is, whether it is a cutting cycle or a hiking cycle. And the second approach is going to be whether there is a tilt in preferences for cutting or hiking based on blue books, currently teal books, that are currently included in teal books. And we split the meetings by this directional tilt in the policy. What we find importantly is that the effect of inflation PMU is significant in those meetings where there is no explicit tilt. It is positive throughout, but the significance emerges for those meetings where no directional tilt is displayed. This result is inconsistent with what would be expected either under conservatism or activism, because these two types of models would particularly deliver predictions where you already have a preference for a particular action and you decide to do less. Okay, so why is inflation tail risk an important consideration for policymakers? Let me just close by saying that credibility concerns have been very significant over that period that we study, and those credibility concerns were tilted towards upper inflation tail risks, even in an environment where inflation remained stable and close to the target. And our simple model tells us that inflation, upper inflation tail risk, even when inflation expectations are relatively stable, will contribute to make policy more appear more hawkish. So there are benefits of practicing this type of risk management, as it helps to anchor inflation expectations of the public, and therefore it makes it easier for the Fed to achieve their objectives. We also saw in recent years, especially post-2022 pivot of the Fed, how policymakers again started to highlight the importance of maintaining the nominal anchor and how it is important for stability in the economy and financial markets. We provide narrative evidence in the paper, walking through the thinking of various policymakers about credibility and worries about upper inflation tail risks. And what we show in narrative evidence is, again, that these concerns about upper inflation tail risk persisted up until the recent period, up until after global financial crisis during the zero lower bound. And were always still connected to thinking about maintaining credibility. So I will conclude, as we are out of time. We use these internal deliberations from transcripts as a window to understand the FOMC's decision-making, and therefore, and by doing that, we hope to cast some light on what was in particular, in addition to the standard factors in decisions, so important for the Fed, and what allowed them to essentially maintain, to obtain this kind of successful outcomes, set of outcomes for inflation and for macroeconomic stability. And we think that managing of these upper inflation tail risk was a very important consideration for them that was determining their policy stance. We highlight that this kind of mechanism could explain why the Fed displayed a preference for lower lower target for inflation below the 2% that is commonly assumed. And this would arise endogenously from a tail risk concerns type of model. The effects of inflation PMU on policy stance are economically large. They are not consistent with, immediately at least, consistent with Brainard's conservatism, and certainly the time series variation in these concerns, how it affects the policy stance, is not consistent with direct conservatism result. Overall, this suggests that over this past decades, the Fed was pursuing a very particular risk management approach centered on managing the upper tail risk in inflation. This serves as some lessons for the design of policy frameworks and the role of risk management in those frameworks going forward. And we have some related work as an advertisement here on the recent episode that we prepared recently for a Brookings conference on Fed's framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. It was a very fantastic presentation and paper, and so rich. So I have a lot of questions. I just want to ask to the people who are to the attendees to raise their hand if they want to ask any question. I will start with mine. So again, thank you very much. I had this question, but you clarified it, distinguishing between uncertainty and risk. It's a bit hard from a narrative perspective. So I will not ask it, even if in the presentation or the paper, there is also a distinction between inflation risk and inflation tail risk. So maybe sometimes some clarifications are needed. So I will just go back to the beginning of the slides, and when you talk about optimal policy, so no need to go back manually, but the question is, okay, when you take your optimal policy, it's always related to a model, and yes, this equation, for instance, we have another vision or interpretation of this equation from Cecchetti, which use instead of the square variance. And then you may not derive the second equation you have here in this slide. So my question is more related, what do you think about what is optimal monetary policy for you? In the sense, do you have an underlying model of the economy, a theoretical model of the economy? Because, you know, optimal policy at the end is just a theoretical perspective. And what I see here is an not ad hoc, but, you know, you choose one central bank loss, which may not be derived according to a theoretical model, and also the fact that it is expressed in square terms instead of variance terms.
Also, we just follow the most standard assumption that assumption underlies also the derivation of the Taylor rule. So it's very, very common in the literature. I mean, when you read on the deliberations regarding the framework design, implicitly there is a discussion of the Fed's objective function, and that goes back to the Fed's mandate. And so I think most policymakers would agree that before 2020, that they had an objective function that was symmetric, and that symmetry is captured here.
Okay.
And I think there is literature that goes deeper how an objective function like this can arise in a kind of socially optimal context. But
I'm not contesting the fact that it is a standard in the literature. I'm for instance, the lambda. So your coefficient lambda here in this equation. So in the literature, if it is optimal policy and not central bank loss perspective, there is a small difference, but it's big in theoretical terms. So this lambda is derived from a theoretical model with micro foundation that I did not see along the paper. So that's fine. I'm not saying that but the fact that we use an ad hoc loss function to talk about optimal monetary policy is a bit not, I mean, in the optimal monetary policy literature, it's quite complicated. So how do you compute your lambda?
It's a parameter for us. It's just a
Okay.
weight on. There is no
Yeah.
depth. In fact, this is really a static, very simple model that is useful at least it was very useful for me to help think about how uncertainty would matter in these models, why it wouldn't matter in simple models, and how it would matter in slightly more complicated ones. When you read the optimal policy under uncertainty, it's actually quite difficult to see immediately how uncertainty matters. And so that was a very stylized way of showing it in a transparent fashion, I would say. Maybe Michael wants to comment on this. I don't know.
No, I agree. Look, the setup is very standard. In fact, it's more general than the original Brainard world. So you know, we allow for effects that are not allowed in standard model.
Oh, I think we lost
distribution
Michael.
Of the macro outcomes, which sorry, anyway, I think it's more general than you're giving it credit for, but the point of the model is just to compare to the exact same frameworks in which most of this literature has been conducted.
No problem.
And then from there we move to the empirical prediction.
Okay. No problem. I just have other questions, and we are a bit short of time, so I wanted. Thank you very much for your answers. I understand the perspective, and it's a sufficient tool to show and to present your research question and the rest of the paper. So okay, that's fine. My second question is: did you think about introducing, or maybe in the next paper, I don't know, some behavioral attention perspective? In the sense that if people, so you are catching the narrative sentiment, a narrative uncertainty, and if people are putting some attention on inflation, it means that the optimal monetary policy in a rational world is not followed, and then there is more attention on a specific parameter or variable, and then you could give to your findings and the research questions a more behavioral attention perspectives, because all along the slide you are talking about inflation uncertainties that is catched by a narrative methodology, and that's not a comment, that's a suggestion. I do think that you could have a very nice behavioral inattention perspective.
Yeah, so again, thank you. That's a great comment. It's a very bare bone way of doing it, just to illustrate that Fed-driven uncertainty mechanism. But you could think about what is this P? Is this objective? Is it not objective?
Exactly.
And then the behavioral stuff comes into play. In fact, we don't discuss this much currently, but we were thinking about models of salience that Andrea Schleifer and co-authors have been writing, where these probabilities are distorted by your losses. So you are not using true probabilities, but you are weighting them by your losses. And it is a model that one could consider to explain some of the empirical findings that we have through the distortion in this probability assessment.
Excellent. Really, I really appreciate this slide, and this is a slide that raised this suggestion in my head. So So thank you very much. I do think it could be very, very interesting and enriching the paper, even if it is already very rich. So maybe you don't need it for this paper, but very interesting. Two last comments. Other people from
Jonathan,
yes,
Jonathan, can
yes,
I just
yes,
add one
yes.
thing? I mean,
Yes, sure.
I think it's still the really striking thing is still that the staff do not seem susceptible to those. So you know, this is why I think the link to reputation and credibility of the policymakers is really important, because whether you want to call that behavioral or salience and worries, you know, the staff who are looking at this stuff all the time do not display the same increases at the same time. I think that's what really strikes the difference for me.
I see. So I think we will talk about maybe in an email. So, but yes, I understand. So again, for the attendees, feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions. I will continue with last one, last half. And so you are talking about predictions in the slide. So just a very short question: did you I did not see any out of sample predictions because yes.
No, we didn't do out of sample. It's a full sample prediction. So, for example, we were predicting the policy path with the Hogdorf score. It wasn't out of sample. Our goal actually is to describe what happened in sample. Granted, you can have small sample issues, but that is what we need for our argument. We want to describe the behavior of policymakers and properties of their thinking over that particular sample period.
Okay, no problem. And my last question, because I don't want to be too much over time. So you talked at the end and a lot about the inflation target, and I do think it's really relevant. But no, today we have a question about the average inflation targeting. And so my question is really policy, like a central banker. What do you think, and how do you think the average inflation targeting framework would impact inflation uncertainty, even among FOMC committee members? Is it related?
Yes, so definitely. So that's why I mentioned that our sample stops in 2015, where the Fed's thinking changed. And in fact, it's changed to overweight worries about downside risks to inflation. And that's why average inflation targeting or flexible average inflation targeting came into play in 2020. So you would think that different types of tail risks were being perceived over that recent period, with inflation undershooting the Fed's target by some basis points, and that became a big source of worry for the Fed when the next demand-driven recession comes along. Leading ultimately to the 2020 framework. That's why we stop in 2015. Now, in particular, for the very recent set of events, or over the past 5 years, we wrote with Michael and Hao Pang about the fact that average inflation targeting or flexible average inflation targeting framework introduced in 2020 paused risk management of the type that we document here, and we provide some suggestive evidence that indeed that has been the case, despite ongoing worries, in fact, very significant worries that the Fed had about upper inflation tail. The Fed decided not to act in 2021, and that was consistent with their communication of what Fed framework would mean for policy. So we have argued that this was a period of suspension in risk management of upper tail risks.
That was exactly my thinking and my point. I do think that you may have to apply all this very rich framework you developed here for this specific period when they change this inflation targeting framework, and if you did that
we did some of that. We did some of that, and we know that over the post 2020 period until 2022, the policy stance was not very sensitive to, at least the one communicated to the outside world through the minutes, was not very sensitive to, was insensitive to inflation upper tail risks. It changed very rapidly with the Fed's pivoting in 2022.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much. If we have any other question from the attendees, please raise your hands. There is no more because we took a lot of time, but that's fine. It was very interesting and so rich. So thank you again, Anna, Michael, and your co-authors for this excellent paper and these fantastic results. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting us. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for all your questions, Jonathan.